Hello, space friends. Captain Snuggles here, bringing you the results of a quick test I recently ran in X4 Foundations. Considering how insanely dominant carriers are, I figured it would be worth learning more about them, specifically, how good they are at deploying and retrieving their subordinates. After all, that's the main thing carriers are supposed to do, but there's no in-game information available on which carriers are better at it than others. Subordinate management is affected by the number of docks, number of hangars, number of launch tubes, and the position of the docks relative to the geometry of the ship. You can see the number of docks and hangars in-game, but that's only half the story. To figure out the effect that launch tubes and ship geometry have on subordinate management, we have to do some testing. Disclaimer: the test results are very likely to change early in 2025 when Egosoft rolls out the new flight model and propulsion rebalance. I decided to go ahead with this test anyway because I can just repeat the test after the update to see whether the changes have had a positive or negative effect on fighters and carriers. So, really, what we're doing here is collecting the before data, and we'll get the after data in a few months. I'm going to quickly interrupt my past self here to say that Beta 7.5 just released, so I hopped in to check it out, including rerunning a portion of this test. If you wanted a more realistic spaceflight sim for your personal ship, you're in luck. But if you were hoping this would improve the AI's flying, I have some bad news for you. Test performance is down by an average of 38%. Meaning ships now take 38% longer to complete the same maneuvers. And that's without including runs where ships encountered crippling navigational failures, which were frequent. Overall, it looks like the carriers that performed worst in this 7.1 test will perform dramatically worse in 7.5, and the ships that performed best in this 7.1 test will perform somewhat worse in 7.5. That said, it's just the first day of the beta, so I'm going to withhold final judgment, but that is the current state of affairs. Now, back to my past self to tell you about the 7.1 test. This test was pretty simple. I set up shop here in Freedom's Reach, loaded in one of each carrier except the Sentinel variants, and grabbed a good number of nice average subordinates. Tacobas for the fighters, and Nemesis Vanguards for the corvettes, all set to attack with Mark II fits. The carriers used minimum presets with Talati engines. Again, we're looking at the bare bones baseline performance, just deploying and retrieving subordinates, not shooting or being shot. One by one, I got the carriers over to this nav beacon, lined them up with this extremely weak station 150 kilometers to the west, and told them to attack. I recorded the time it took them to fly to their deployment point 45 kilometers east of the station. Then I recorded how long it took them to deploy all their fighters, as well as the time it took them to deploy all their corvettes. I considered full deployment to be the point at which all ships were fully disembarked from the carrier and were in travel drive straight towards the station. Then, once all subordinates were fully deployed, I removed the carrier's orders and recalled subordinates. I recorded the time it took for all fighters to dock, as well as for all corvettes to dock. So, I ended up with 5 numbers: approach time, fighter deployment time, corvette deployment time, fighter retrieval time, and corvette retrieval time. I ran 2 repetitions and took the averages, cross-referenced those results with the carrier's basic stats to derive a couple of other metrics, and that was that. Now, without further ado, I'll walk you through the results. I'll go over the numbers for each ship, talk through why it got the results it did, and briefly discuss what the results might mean in the context of the ship's other key features. Here's the spreadsheet. In the bottom left, we have the time it took for the initial approach to the target, broken down by engine type. This just represents short-range battlefield mobility. For longer range mobility, check out my X4 Propulsion Lab series. Then, in the bottom right, we have some of the carrier's basic stats, all of which are accounted for in the next sections. Those next sections are fighter management in the top left and corvette management in the top right. Within those two sections, we have stats for ships launched and ships docked per minute, ships launched and ships docked per minute per 10 million credits of base price, and a cycle time showing how long it takes to fully deploy and fully retrieve a full complement of subordinates. The reason we want all of those stats separately is because you're not always working with a full complement of subordinates. You can, of course, use fewer fighters than your carrier can hold, and you can also use more, up to a maximum of 256 subordinates per carrier, which is especially important with the position defense command. So, although the cycle time is going to be representative of quote-unquote normal carrier usage, we do also want to consider the raw deployment and retrieval rates, as well as the associated cost effectiveness. With the deployment rates, bear in mind that launch tubes are only utilized if the fighter has an active attack command when it undocks. No attack, no launch tube. Launch tubes deploy fighters much faster than docks, so with some ships, deployment times for non-combat commands will be dramatically longer than what's shown here. I'm choosing to focus on combat deployment for this test. That's the overview. Let's talk through the results themselves. We'll start small with the Guppy. It's the smallest and cheapest carrier, incapable of using medium ships at all, and only carrying a measly 16 small ships. It is nice and mobile, and it comes out as the most cost-effective choice for fighter retrieval, although its raw retrieval rate is only average, and its deployment rate is quite low. Still, those rates are good enough to give its tiny little fighter complement the fastest cycle time of any carrier, making it a good skirmisher that can get in and out of fights quickly. Moving up the list, we immediately enter the middle ground, what I call the fleet carriers, in an intermediate bracket of both size and cost. The first fleet carrier on my list is the only base game legacy carrier that has not received an E-class variant. This is the Condor, specifically the Condor Vanguard. It is very cheap, with an average ship capacity, average mobility, and average handling of medium ships. It has slightly fewer docks than average, but with 6 launch tubes, it manages to eke out a nice average fighter deployment rate. The launch tubes don't help with docking, though, so its retrieval rate is low. I will add that its dock layout is very good. The triangular arrangement around the ship's central axis helps to cut down on traffic jams, and it evenly distributes the turret firing arcs of docked medium ships. It also has good cargo capacity. Overall, the Condor is an old workhorse. Not particularly impressive, but always reliable. Moving on, we come to the Zeus Vanguard. This is a legacy carrier with a reasonable price, moderate ship capacity, good mobility, and acceptable handling of medium ships. It has an extremely good fighter deployment rate thanks to its 10 side-facing launch tubes, but it has a below-average fighter retrieval rate because fighters tend to get stuck underneath the wide, flat pancake hull. Those two things combined give it an average fighter cycle time overall. This is a good carrier in terms of both raw stats and cost effectiveness. It's well suited to just about any carrier role. Unfortunately, as a legacy ship, its style and its level of graphical detail are noticeably different than newer ships. Or, in other words, it's a little bit ugly, especially when compared to its updated version. That updated version is the Zeus E. Compared to the Vanguard, it is much prettier, noticeably faster, and has a bit more hull HP. On the other hand, it's much more expensive, it only carries half as many fighters, and its pancake hull is even wider, which exacerbates the problem with fighter docking. The combination of high speed and fast fighter deployment makes this a pretty good rapid response ship, but the low fighter capacity makes it poorly suited for serious engagements, and the poor retrieval time reduces its effectiveness as a skirmisher, which leaves it in a very niche role somewhere between skirmishing and serious combat. Overall, it's hard to find an objective, quantitative reason to take the E over the Vanguard, but subjectively, I slightly prefer the E purely because of the cosmetics. Now get ready for some deja vu, because we're moving on to a very similar pair of ships, the Colossi. The Legacy version, the Colossus Vanguard, is extremely cheap, has average mobility, carries a respectable number of subordinate ships, and achieved slightly above average results across the board. Just like the Zeus, it has 10 launch tubes, but they point forward and aft instead of side to side, which leads to more collisions between the fighters and the carrier, which slightly reduces the overall fighter deployment rate. Still, the deployment rate is good, and the Colossus doesn't suffer from the same geometry issues as the Zeus, so it has a respectable retrieval rate. This is a strong contender for the most cost-effective carrier overall. Unfortunately, it's a legacy ship, so it's a bit ugly. The updated version is the Colossus E. For about 5 million extra credits, you get a much prettier ship with noticeably better mobility, defense, and cargo capacity, but it carries 25% fewer fighters. Otherwise, the E and the Vanguard perform very similarly in terms of their handling of small and medium subordinates, above average across the board, well suited to almost any role, but because the Vanguard costs less, it's more cost effective. Compared to the Zeus, I think it's easier to justify taking the Colossus E over the Vanguard, but the Vanguard is probably the objectively superior ship by a narrow margin. Still, I do like that cosmetic upgrade. With that, we've wrapped up the fleet carriers and are moving on to the super carriers. Sort of. The next ship is the Tokyo, which has the price tag of a supercarrier, but the performance does not match the price. Not only is it dramatically weaker than the two true supercarriers, it's also weaker than most of the fleet carriers. It is very slightly above average at fighter retrieval thanks to its 2 entry ports and plentiful docks, and it also carries more fighters than average. Otherwise, it's all bad news. The complete lack of launch tubes and the internal dock placement make it bad at fighter deployment, especially while the Tokyo is in motion. It has a tendency to collide with its own fighters and absorb them into its hull. It's also miserable at medium ship management, with just 1 M-dock and a cycle time of a whopping 15 minutes. You're better off using that M storage for non-combat purposes, like carrying transport ships with extra supplies. In terms of its other stats, the Tokyo has poor mobility, below average defense, and above average weaponry, until you consider that every M-dock provides up to 6 additional turrets, which downgrades its weaponry to just average. The Tokyo isn't particularly good at anything, and for that price, it really should be. On the flip side, because it's a Terran ship, it gives you an excuse to listen to Rise of the Protectorate, which is, objectively, the best song in the game. Of course, the next ship on our list excels in multiple fields, and it gives you an excuse to listen to Return to Kingdom End, which is, objectively, the second best song in the game. That ship is the Shark. It's one of the true supercarriers, with a high price tag, best-in-class mobility, strongest defense in the game, high cargo capacity, high fighter capacity, and the ability to dock and retrieve all those fighters very quickly. That excellent fighter management is thanks to its 4 ventral launch tubes, as well as its unique dock design. All 16 docks essentially have a short-range tractor beam that catapults fighters out when they launch and pulls them in when they dock, which greatly accelerates both processes. The Shark only struggles with one aspect of subordinate management, which is medium ship deployment. It lags a bit behind the fleet carriers in that regard, despite having the same number of docks, because it has this dorsal divider that tends to complicate launches. It doesn't cause major problems for retrieval, though. The Shark is at least as good as the fleet carriers when it comes to scooping up corvettes. My only other note on the Shark is that it has a below-average number of turrets, but an above-average missile capacity, so you can make it pack a punch if you want to. Really though, this ship is designed purely to excel at quote-unquote normal carrier operations. And it does. It is fantastic for transporting, deploying, and retrieving large numbers of fighters quickly, even under heavy fire. That is the exact opposite of the last ship on our list, the Raptor. This ship was not designed to excel at carrier operations. I'm not convinced it was designed to be a carrier at all. By all appearances, the Split created a big badass battleship bristling with weaponry, then decided it needed even more firepower, so they hollowed it out and filled it with as many fighters as they could possibly fit. Minor details, like needing to launch all those fighters, were an afterthought. What we've ended up with is an absolutely insane ship with the highest price in its class, the weakest shields in its class, the most guns in the universe, poor mobility, poor cargo capacity, the highest capacity by far for both small and medium ships, and the slowest cycle time by far for both small and medium ships. It has no launch tubes. Fighters have to undock and fly almost the entire length of the hull inside the ship before slowly exiting out of a hole in the bow. If the Raptor is moving during deployment, there are constant collisions inside the hull, and it's pretty common to see fighters tumbling out the wrong end of the ship, shieldless and out of control. And the fighters are the good part. With a capacity for 31 medium ships, but only 1 M-Dock, the Raptor has a medium cycle time of almost 32 minutes. This thing is absurd. Highly impractical as a carrier, but we love it anyway. At least the Split thought to include some automation for fighter docking. There are 3 lanes in the entry port here, so if fighters can just navigate to the opening, they'll be pulled to their dock, up to 3 at a time, tractor beam style. As a result, the Raptor has a pretty good fighter retrieval rate in terms of absolute numbers, though not when compared to its price or its total fighter capacity. Overall, the Raptor is best suited to position defense, which only requires very gradual cycling of fighters, and also allows you to control the carrier and fighters separately. And there you have it. That's all the results. I doubt any of this came as a surprise to the veterans. If you were surprised by anything, if your favorite carrier didn't perform well, don't worry. The term worst carrier is sort of like poorest Kardashian. It might be true in relative terms, but in absolute terms, it's not a huge deal. Still, I wanted this info for my future reference, and I wanted to share it with you all as well. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll tune in next time, and until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.